Ladies and gentlemen, angry Americans around the country and around the world, and visitors and hosts from the BetaWorks community, welcome to Angry Americans, and welcome to another important, iconic, inspiring conversation with the great and powerful Yael Eisenstat. Please give her a round of applause, everybody. So for folks listening, we are at BetaWorks, which is an exceptionally exciting and dynamic community here on the west side of New York. Thank you for hosting us. We are on a cool stage surrounded, we're kind of between two ferns, actually. I don't know if this was intended. Zach Galifianakis fans will understand the reference. But Yael, thank you for joining us, and thank you for being here, and thank you for having this conversation with me. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. And again, I want you to do all my introductions for the rest of my life. It's very, very flattering.
Yeah, well, it's kind of exciting to be able to introduce you properly, because I feel like you probably had a real challenge introducing yourself for a long period of time, right?
Yeah, actually, some of my friends can attest whenever people ask me, like, who are you or what do you do? It's always like kind of fumble through it. I'm not great at introducing myself.
We'll get into that in a second. One question I ask of everyone is, what is your preferred adult beverage of choice? And it's an insight into who you are and every guest. So I always ask, what's your drink of choice? And can you tell us, please, what is your choice and why?
Yeah. So I'm a vodka drinker. I just drink my vodka straight on the rocks, putting a little water in it tonight just to pace myself because, you know, lots of people have tried to pour me more drinks to get my secrets out of me. So the water's to pace myself, but I'm a vodka on the rocks kind of gal.
Can I ask you, since you do have a background in the CIA, is there actually a class that you've taken that teaches you how to drink?
There isn't, but the funny thing is I actually didn't drink until I had no other options once I got my security clearance. I didn't start drinking till I joined the CIA.
Ah.
You can make what you want from that statement.
But because you grew up in Northern California.
I did grow up in Northern California.
So I imagine that you experienced all that Northern California has to offer growing up.
I did experience all that.
So I want to start there, Yael. How did you go from Northern California to almost 2 decades working in the CIA? I know it was, your life has been an incredible journey, but can you talk about what inspired you to end up in the CIA and how that came to be, please?
Sure. Yeah, you sip. I'll sip after my intro story. I grew up actually in the Silicon Valley of all places. And from a very young age, there was something about growing up in Palo Alto and Los Altos Hills in that area that there was something about it that just didn't completely mesh with who I was. From a very young age, I had a global perspective, probably in part because my mom is not originally from the US. And I always wanted to see what was out there beyond just the little bubble I was living in. So decided very early on that I was going to focus on international affairs and see what that led to. So I'll fast forward, spent a year of high school overseas, a year of college overseas, and then went to DC for grad school. And in 1999, when you graduate with, master's in international affairs, back then you didn't think as much of what companies can play this role on stage. You really think about government. Now, this is not the sexy CIA story people want to hear. I really wanted to work at USAID or State Department, but they both had hiring freezes in 1999 because I was like this, weird lefty curly hair girl from California who just wanted to go around the world and do great things and help, work on foreign policy and figure out what the US's role in the world could be. So those 2 places had hiring freezes, and someone's like, oh, well, you should just throw your resume in at the CIA. It's like, wow, that sounded scary, but I did. And oddly enough, they called me right away. And this was before September 11th. So I went in, they still interviewed in the building at the time. And I went in and I interviewed and then went home that night. And I was like, that was really weird. I was just in the CIA and just went out and partied all night with my friends. And they called me at 8:00 the next morning when I was not very coherent and ready to be woken up by the phone. And they made an offer the next morning for exactly what I said I wanted to do. I said I had spent some time in Africa. It was the part of the world that was most interesting to me. And when I applied, I did not apply to work at the CIA. I applied to work on African affairs and African political issues. And that's what they offered.
And can you go through that thought process? Because I joined the military in 1998, right? And we thought maybe you go to Bosnia. There was no looming threat of Iraq and Afghanistan. There was no 9/11. So it's not the national security environment that young people are waking up to and launching into now. And I went from an elite liberal arts school in Western Massachusetts, Amherst College, which couldn't have been farther away from the Army than maybe Berkeley and the CIA. So can you talk about what you were thinking during that time period and the trajectory you thought it might take you on?
Sure. I mean, this was a period of time, late 90s, you're post-Cold War, you're pre-September 11th. It is just kind of this, what is the world going to look like? How is the world going to develop? What is the U.S.'s role going to be in it? And those were all super interesting questions to me. And I mean, the first time I'd gone to Africa, it was like, throw a guitar on my back, go just play music. It was actually music and art that drew me to that part of the world to begin with. So it really maybe was a little bit sort of wide-eyed, a little bit just excited to really dig in on how the world is going to, again, it was a little bit of a weird time in the 90s. It was post-Cold War, post-Berlin Wall coming down, not really knowing how the world's going to turn out. It was all very exciting. So I just wanted to play a part in that excitement and in understanding how different cultures can work together and how different people can work together. So that was the thought process.
And there's a lot of elements of your experience that I want to dig into, but 2 weeks ago, a young 23-year-old Army specialist was killed in Kenya. Most people in America don't even realize we have military forces in Kenya. We talk a lot in this show about the forever war and how many different places our military is engaged in on a daily basis that's often forgotten from the headlines. So can you give us your perspective on that? And specifically the disconnect that exists between what our military and clandestine forces are doing in Kenya specifically and in Africa, given that everyone is barely focused on Afghanistan or Iraq, much less Kenya.
Yeah. So I spent 2 years in Kenya as a Foreign Service officer. So over my career, I worked for about 4 or 5 different government agencies. So I was in Kenya from 2004 to 2006 as a diplomat. And of the various roles I played there, one was the political military officer. So that meant that I had to work with the U.S. military there because, and if I get into too much detail, just give me like the pull the ear or something. But
I will definitely not pull your ear.
Okay.
You're one of the few people that could definitely kill me that I've interviewed. Most people I could take out. I think that you have the advantage here. So I'm not pulling on your ear.
I meant pull your own ear, but okay, yes.
I will trust you to, I will trust you, as I told you earlier, I will trust you to censor what you need to for reasons of national security.
Yeah. So what that meant is the U.S. military, listen, Kenya was not a combat zone. So that means that the military is not in charge, whereas in Afghanistan and Iraq, they are. So you put a civilian like me who has to work with the U.S. military to really figure out everything how we work with Kenyans and whatnot. So long story short, I spent a lot of time up in the coastal part of Kenya. In particular, spent a lot of time in this little area called Lamu. And it's sort of the northern tip of the coastal part of Kenya, very close to Somalia. It shares a border with Somalia. And a lot of the work that I was doing in that part of the world was really, I mean, it's not a politically correct term, but a lot of it is the hearts and minds type of work, right? It's building bridges with communities, while at the same time, and the U.S. military was also helping the Kenyans build up a Coast Guard and was there to help the Kenyans figure out how to secure their own borders. So what happened it was a few weeks ago, I think, most people missed it, is that there was Al-Shabaab, the terrorist group from Somalia, this is pretty shocking, infiltrated the military base that U.S. military are sharing with the Kenyans in Lamu. And most people don't necessarily know that base is there. So the fact that Al-Shabaab was able to even attack that base, to me, was shocking. There were very conflicted reports in the beginning, including us not admitting if it had really been breached. To me, what was really important in that moment was to realize that there were a few things that were going on in my mind. One is, wow, Al-Shabaab has actually gained the capability to possibly breach a military base that the U.S. is securing. That's shocking. But two, it's also, I was a little bit concerned about how are we going to react to this? Because at the end of the day, we are there to help the Kenyans secure this part of their country. The Kenyans want us there. The Kenyans are dealing with the threat at their border. For me, I spent so much time with people in these different villages along that border there. And it's always the civilians that are going to suffer if things escalate. It's always those people in those villages who are just happen by geographical unluckiness to be sitting right along that border there. And so I was really nervous. It happened right after the Iran thing, right? It happened right after Soleimani.
That weekend. Yeah.
And immediately you see, speaking of what we're going to talk about in a minute, the amount of disinformation that starts to spread online. A lot of self-appointed experts start tweeting that this must have something to do with Iran, that al-Shabaab was clearly paying the US back for us killing Soleimani. None of that is true. But that rhetoric starts to build up, and my concern is, does that become a talking point for this administration to take stronger action in Somalia that could really affect these populations? So that whole thing became very messy.
So it's kind of all been messy, especially over the last 3 years. And you've right. I mean, you've demonstrated courage time and time again. You know, your decision to step up to serve, but maybe in my view, one of the most courageous moments was when you chose to essentially out yourself as a CIA analyst through a New York Times op-ed. And I would like you to please share that story. And if you can take us through your thought process. In 2004, I came home from Iraq and was one of the first soldiers to publicly criticize the war opposite the president on a public stage. So I remember in a very different way what it was like to make that transition. You go across the Rubicon, and once you speak out, and mine was in a political speech opposite the president, and then 24 hours later was George Stephanopoulos on ABC, and you went through a similar run where you had the New York Times op-ed and then all the major media sources. So can you take us through those days prior and what led you to that moment and why it was so important for you to speak out?
Sure. What's really interesting is I had never planned to talk about my CIA past publicly. It was never something I was trying to do. It was never something I planned to do. I had reinvented myself as a private citizen, which is harder than people realize when you come out of that world. And I'd managed to do it. And it really started in late 2015 as I started watching the rhetoric heating up here ahead of the elections and started getting more and more concerned, like a lot of people were, about this breakdown of civil discourse, what was going on. But it was that moment. So if you recall, on Inauguration Day, so I went to the Women's March that day. It was the first moment in a number of months where I felt inspired and felt a little bit hopeful again. We all dealt with the elections in our own way. For me, I will be very honest, I actually felt betrayed by my country. I felt like this was a country I had served. This was a country I had done so much for. And in that moment, I felt betrayed. So I was very down. And then the Women's March happened and I felt inspired for the first time in a long time. And I come home, my phone had been off all day. I come home and there's just like so many messages on my phone. Did you see it? Did you see it? Did you see it? So you may recall Trump made a speech on like day 2 or day 1 at the CIA in front of the Wall of Stars, which is the wall that commemorates people who died in service. And many of those stars don't even have names attached to them because they're classified. And it's for the agency, it's hallowed ground.
It's like the CIA's Arlington.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he gave this speech in front of the wall. And it wasn't just that he gave this speech. He had been, for me, I was watching for months how he was denigrating the intelligence community. And whatever you think about the intelligence community, let me be clear, I never planned to be the great defender of the CIA when I left. That was never my goal. But the dangers of a president who intentionally denigrates the intelligence community and the so-called deep state, that is, to me, a demonstration of what's to come. And that is right out of a dictator's playbook. So he stood up on that stage in front of the Wall of Stars and talked about his numbers at inauguration and went on and bragged about it and like didn't even thank the men and women that were there. And it infuriated me. So that night, I got really, really angry. Angry Americans. I was an angry American that night. And I just started writing. And then I had a phone call with one of the reporters that had been at the CIA that day. And he knew my background and he wanted to get a quote for me. And I kind of yelled at him, you shouldn't have even been there. The press should not be at the CIA when a president gives a speech there. I had been there when Vice President Biden had given a speech there. That is the one place you come just to tell the men and women who work there how important their work is, because nobody will ever know their names. And so actually the night before my New York Times piece, he asked me what I thought about it. And he said, well, what do you think about this standing ovation that Trump is now bragging about on TV? And I said, well, of course he got a standing ovation. The men and women in the CIA do not sit down in front of their commander-in-chief until told to do so. And I watched it. He never told them to sit. And he said, well, can I quote you on that? And I hadn't said anything publicly yet. And that was the moment where it was, to me protecting my past was less important than being able to really help people understand what was going on. So I said, you can quote me on the record. In his defense, most journalists would be like, awesome, bye, click, right? And he asked me, he said, are you sure? And I said, yeah, because this is way bigger than me. And then I wrote the piece that night, and in the New York Times the next day, the op-ed came out talking about the star on the wall behind the president that represented my colleague that had died overseas, which, by the way, that star had been classified. It wasn't until I looked it up online that I realized his star had been declassified at that point, and I could tell his story. So I felt like honoring his story in that piece as well. But just to quickly sum up the thought process that night, for me, I had carried the secret for 17 years, right? I mean, very few people knew this about my past. They probably assumed and they probably guessed, but I didn't say it out loud. For me, the secret was actually bigger than it needed to be, because for me to tell the entire world, especially in the New York Times, about that part of my past was scarier than anything I'd ever done. It was scarier than having guns pointed at me. It was scarier than anything I had done in scary parts of the world. And you know what? I woke up the next day and I was still alive. And in a way, I unburdened that secret.
It's an incredibly important story of courage and patriotism. I think it was a time when the president had just started to politicize the intelligence community and the national security apparatus, and now it's become a standard playbook. When he rolled out his statement on Soleimani, he had the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the Army Chief of Staff flanking him in a way that you don't see in America. You don't see a civilian commander-in-chief walk out and say, look at my guns, right? Which is what he's done. But he's also very shrewdly cannibalized that political power, because he knows that in many ways, troops, veterans, national security folks are the ultimate populist issue. But you really have spoken, Yael, effectively about the fear. But can you talk about maybe that 24, 48 hours afterward where you have this kind of, it's got to be an out-of-body experience. I had Mayor Pete Buttigieg on the show a couple weeks ago, and I asked him, you were relatively unknown 8 months ago. Now you're world famous. But you were a covert asset for the CIA, and then you're sitting on CNN. What is that 24 hours like for you? And calls from your family or people from college saying, holy shit, you're in the CIA? Like, what is that like for you as a human being?
I feel like I need to start by saying I was not a covert asset before the agency gets mad at me.
Thank you for the clarification. I appreciate that.
But it's actually funny. I was supposed to have dinner with a few friends that night, and I emailed them. I was in my pajamas under a blanket on my couch. That was actually how I spent that day. And I decided day one, don't look at don't look at social media. Don't read the emails. And then I said to them, can we have dinner as close to my house as possible tonight? Because something's going to drop at 3 p.m. and I don't know how I'm going to feel by dinner time. And I'm like, okay. So we went to dinner, and by that point it had hit, and I didn't pay attention the first day. And when the second round of drinks were ordered, and I was like, well, it's not like I'll go on CNN tomorrow, so bring it on, because I just did not want to be a news person. I didn't want to be the story. So we drank way too much that night. And then at 5 a.m., the emails from every major network start coming in. And I said no, I didn't want to do it. And friends of mine who are still in government are the ones who convinced me to go on CNN the next day. because they said, you're speaking for people who can't speak right now. And so they, in a way, put that weight on me. But that if you ever see that CNN interview, you can tell how uncomfortable I am in it. And it's not that I'm uncomfortable with speaking. I'm uncomfortable with ever feeling like I'm exploiting any part of my past for anything that looks like self-promotion. But to me, it was so important to help Americans understand. We all are so bombarded with so much information right now. To me, I really wanted to help people understand when you have a president that is intentionally degrading the very people that, whether you like them or not, and however you feel about the intel community or the military, at the end of the day, they're still the ones that are going to keep you safe when the shit hits the fan. So I was going through all that. And then there's the funny moments where I finally resurfaced and get online and like ex-boyfriends are like, oh, hey. I was like, oh yeah, sorry. Forgot to mention that part. And so like, it got weird. It got weird after that.
Yes. This is going to make a great movie one day. But take us, I want to stay on a moment that you shared that I think is important for people to understand. The national intelligence community can often seem like this monolith. But part of your motivation was sharing the story of your colleague that was represented on the wall by the star. Can you share that story? Tell us who that colleague was and why it was important that he be memorialized with a star on that wall?
Sure. You're going to see me going through what is public and what is not in my brain right now. This was a colleague that I had met while I was in Ethiopia. And he was killed in Ethiopia. And what I remember, in addition to, and I think I wrote about this in the piece, when I worked with him in Ethiopia a little bit, not worked with him, but when I met him, when I was there traveling for work, he and I don't know if he was a Republican or a Democrat. I don't know if he was conservative or liberal. I don't know about any of his political leanings. I know that he was absolutely dedicated to his work, to national security of our country, and he was just a really freaking cool guy. His name is Greg Wenzel. And I just remember when we had the memorial service for him at the agency, and his name wasn't public. There's a star and it just says anonymous because he hadn't been declassified yet. And I remember watching his parents at the memorial service. And I remember thinking, these parents just lost a son who, by the way, the important thing to know about him, he was a law student. I think he was a lawyer. He could have gone off and made a lot of money as a lawyer and decided that this was what he wanted to do instead. And I watched his parents knowing, he's classified. You're never going to be able to tell anybody why he really died. You won't even be able to tell anybody he died in Ethiopia. That was really heartbreaking. So he is just, to me, one of those people who, in addition to just, I mean, he's a smart ass. We joked, we had fun. He's one of those guys that if he was sitting up here, you would all want to have a drink with him, but you would know nothing about him. So to me, it was also really important to just make it human, make people understand that star is a human being that you might have actually really liked. And he's being denigrated right now because of the president standing in front of his star, lying about the numbers of people who showed up at his inauguration. And even just to point out, he pointed at everybody in the CIA that day and said, how many of you voted for me?
Right.
Let that sink in. The president pointed at the men and women in the CIA and said, who here voted for me?
So I think there are a lot of folks inside the CIA, whether they can be open about it or not, who are frustrated to say the least, probably angry about the state of affairs and about leadership. But this is a question I ask of all of our guests. So Yael Eisenstat, what makes you angry?
Well, that could take the rest of the podcast. So I'll just narrow it down to two things. One, because I told you this back there, what will make me angry is if I have something in my teeth and my friends don't tell me. Like, that will end our friendship. Just, it's very clear. If there's spinach in my teeth and you do not tell me, because we did a teeth check before I came out. And two, there's so many things, but to me, one of the things is hypocrisy. Hypocrisy really pisses me off. If you and I have different viewpoints on things, if we have different political ideas, if we have different perspectives, I'm fine with all of that. But if you're hypocritical about it, that infuriates me.
Understandably. I don't think you're a person that anyone wants to piss off. And now you're in this new role where you are a voice for the voiceless. You're an advocate, you're an educator. But again, going back to your roots, you grew up in Northern California. Another question I ask of all of our guests, Yael, what was your first car?
So my first car was supposed to be this weird little peach-colored Datsun we called the Peachy car. But my babysitter crashed it right before my 16th birthday. And I was going to get like the clunker Peachy car Datsun. So my first car ended up being a nicer Honda Civic, which then a year later, a woman ran a stop sign and it got crashed and totaled and broke my femur. Like, it was terrible. Almost died. But so that's 2 cars in a row.
What color was that second car?
The second car was a gray Honda Civic. Yeah.
There's never a boring answer to that question. So for those of you that are new to this podcast, like, why is he asking about a freaking car? There's almost always an interesting story. And that's a new one.
It changed the whole trajectory of my life, too.
It did?
I was 17. I had different ideas of what I wanted to do with my life. I'm going to keep that one, though, a little bit internal right now. But the broken femur, the metal rod down my leg, there were reasons why I couldn't do what I actually wanted to do. So I ended up at the CIA instead.
And
yeah,
later you end up at Facebook.
Yes.
Which is an interesting, transition from public service and the national intelligence industry. You also were very vocal in the way you departed Facebook. Can you explain for folks who may be new to your experience what you were hired to do or what you thought you were going to do and why you left?
Sure. So I left government in 2013, and my biggest goal was to figure out who the biggest, baddest corporation in the world who is having profound impacts on the world was, and help them think through how to work with local communities better, particularly in Africa. In 2013, that wasn't Facebook yet. It oddly enough was ExxonMobil, which is where I ended up for 2 years, heading their corporate social responsibility strategy. But then in 2015, 2016, I started writing about the breakdown in civil discourse. Actually wrote this piece exploring why was it easier for me to engage with suspected extremists and terrorists along the Somalia border than it is for me to talk to Americans now on the opposite side of a political issue. And if that's happening to me, what does that mean for the future of our democracy? So I wrote that in Time magazine, start really digging in on what's going on. Like, what is exacerbating this polarization that's always existed here? And so, of course, it takes me to starting to look at social media. So just as I'm getting asked to keynote big tech conferences to talk about this, Facebook calls. And long story short, we went through a long process because I am not taking a job because I want the free kombucha. If I'm taking this job, it's because I think you are a fundamental threat to our democracy right now. Although I also love certain things about Facebook. I love how you have allowed me to stay connected to my friends around the world. If you are offering me the opportunity to come in and really help diagnose this problem and try to help fix it, then great. So they offered me a very shiny title that spoke to, it's almost like they purposely spoke to the core of the type of person I am. And they offered me this title of Head of Global Elections Integrity Operations.
Which might appear to be an oxymoron in and of itself to most people.
Right. And to be clear, the other thing they didn't really explain very well during the interview process is that's within business integrity, which is a part of Facebook that is really responsible for everything they monetize, which means political ads. They made the offer, the final offer, 1 minute after Zuckerberg's hearing ended on the Hill, if we all remember that fun Senate hearing. I pushed back with all my don't hire me if you don't mean it. This is who I am. Don't make this offer if you don't want me to come in and do this job. So I was very clear. And I went in with the best intentions of I still love the idea of a platform like Facebook. And yes, I want to help this company figure out how to not destroy democracy. But I was just never empowered to do anything. So, I mean, on day 2, they took my title away. They told me I was not going to have, because they told me I'd get to hire my own team. They told me that it was up to me how many people that, like, they made every promise that I asked for, and then took that all away on day 2. Now, just to be really clear, I want to be really clear on this. I can only speak to my experience, and my experience was in the business integrity org. Had I been hired into a different part of Facebook, I don't know. Maybe it would have been different, but unfortunately, that was my situation. So a few months later, but I did. So I also immediately knew, okay, well then I better learn as much as I can while I'm still here. Listen, you don't hire a former CIA officer and then tell me not to look under the rugs. Like, that's your own fault. That's just kind of stupid to think that's not how I'm going to operate. To me, it was really important to learn how did we get here in order to fix it. And I really felt like nobody wanted me to talk about how did we get here. And that's what an analyst would do. They would analyze how did we get here in order to fix it, right? So to be clear, there were lots of employees there who were super excited I was there, who were thirsty for someone to help them think differently through it. The layers above me were not. And so I told them a few months later, you hired me to do this. I am not empowered to do this. Either you find me somewhere within this company to do the work you hired me to do, or I'm out. And they did not find me that place to do that. And so a few months later, I mean, the irony, I've never said this out loud. I don't know if I quit or if I was fired because I laid down the marker of I give you 2 months to figure out how to empower me or I'm out. And they did not. So there you go.
That's like most members of Trump's cabinet that have left. They don't know if they've been fired or they quit either. But at its core, Yael, who has more information about the average American, the CIA or Facebook?
I mean, obviously Facebook, because we give it up voluntarily. So I think one thing people don't understand about the CIA, as much as you think that the deep state and the almighty are tracking your every move, the CIA really doesn't give a shit about most of you in this room. Don't take that in a negative way. They just don't. Like, the CIA is actually looking at foreign information and foreign threats and whatnot. The FBI is a different story. But the CIA doesn't care about any of you unless you are somehow connected to a foreign terrorist organization that's plotting here. Facebook, you guys give it all up. Like, they know way more about you, but that's kind of our own faults too.
So yeah, you created a paper recently with John and a number of other technology leaders here at BetaWorks on kind of what you'd like to see Facebook change to help democracy. I'm paraphrasing. You can maybe help me on that. But for especially folks who aren't as close to it, who aren't deeply entrenched in the technology community, can you be an analyst for us? Identify the problem and recommend your solution for the best interest of our democracy.
Sure. So there's 2 things. The paper we did together with John and Chris Hughes and a number of people, it was the immediate things the company can do ahead of our 2020 elections. I'm going to back up before I get to that one and say, short of all the things I'd actually like to see done, so there's the pragmatist of here is what you can do, and here are some things that should not be terribly difficult for Facebook to debate to get done. But on a higher level, before we get to that, is government has to step up. We have a platform that basically, for me, it's always been about the business model. You have a company, and I don't want to make it just about Facebook. There are other companies that do this, but that is where I worked, so that is what my firsthand experience is from. You have a company that uses our human behavioral data, which we hand over, but it's still not totally transparent about how much they track us all over the internet. But they're using our human behavioral data to categorize us and to segment us into different categories. Why? So that they can set us up to be targeted with these personal ads that make us all feel a little better because, oh, they made my life so much easier. They're sending me the ads I want to see. They're showing me the content I want to see. Personalization, customization, that sounds great. It's just so much easier. But with that human behavioral data, they are literally able to take that same data, which might work if they're sending you a Nike ad instead of whatever other ad because, hey, I actually like Nike more. Great. That's fine. I really don't care about that. But those same tools are being used by people like politicians and like people who want to actually divide us for their own geopolitical purposes, such as the Russians. They get those same exact tools that Nike's getting. And the danger there is that, let's back up a step, polarization, anger, mistrust, political rhetoric, that's always been a part of the American landscape, right? None of that's new. And the media has always been hyper divisive and all of that. But these tools that allow them to segment us into these different categories and then target us with ads. And don't forget, in order to do that, they have to keep you on their screen as long as humanly possible. So what does that mean? That means their algorithms end up optimizing for keeping you engaged. And you are more likely to remain engaged if the next thing you see is a little more salacious than the last thing you saw. So I'm not going to get into the whole filter bubble conversation. Hopefully most of you are well familiar with that. But why is the filter bubble thing so dangerous? Because not only is it breaking down our ability to recognize that people who do not necessarily fit our perception of what is right in the world are not necessarily evil. It pushes us further and further into these extreme mindsets. And they're doing it all to keep you engaged so that they can sell us ads. And why does that matter for elections and what we're talking about now? Is because then politicians can come in and they can hyper target us with their ads. The two of you, I'm just pointing at two people, might both live in New York, might even live across the street from each other. And it is very possible you are shown two totally different versions of a political ad from the same politician. So how can the two of you then have a conversation about what you just saw and debate how you feel about it? You can't, because you're not even seeing the same version of truth. And so those are the tools that are super dangerous to me. And those are the things that I would like to see regulated, and we can talk about, or I've written about that. But so, separate from the government actually getting their act together, and they're trying, but I get it, it's complicated. They're not going to get it figured out in time for our election. So that's where John and Chris pulled together this very interesting group of people who all have really inside knowledge of how these things work, to say, here are some things we can do short of regulating you, that you as a platform can choose to stand up and do to protect our elections.
It's kind of a 10-point plan. And for folks listening on the podcast, we'll post it at angryamericans.us, and you can read up and share and advocate for the change that I think is common sense. But Yael, there's been kind of a through line throughout your career, and it's that you're a guardian for America, really, at a time when we need more guardians. I've spoken at times. A friend of mine who was both in the clergy and in the military said once that if America were a religion, the military would be like the clergy. We're the ones that are supposed to uphold the values, be the samurai, the keepers of the flame, right, to protect the country beyond the political influences. But it's this time where people like you, or you in particular, you've stepped up in the CIA, you've stepped up again, you keep stepping up, but you've also redefined patriotism. And I think that's important right now, given the way this president has co-opted it and manipulated it. So can you just share for a second your thoughts on what patriotism means in this moment? And especially given your background, because a lot of folks, we're in New York City, sometime the quote unquote coastal elites or the technology community can feel very far away from national security and defense. And there's this constant friction that I've seen working in the Valley and working in other places where folks just don't know how to reconcile their issues with the president or with the policy and their national security imperative on some level. So can you share with us your thoughts on what does patriotism mean for you right now?
Yeah, it's a big question. It's interesting. Growing up, I never identified with the word patriotism. Even when I served, I didn't identify with the word. Because to me, the word always meant pin wearing, flag waving, bravado, all these things that I didn't identify with. It had been co-opted by a certain part of our society as this thing that just didn't feel like it was me. So fast forward to today, the reason I decided to stand up and write that piece about Trump, and more recently, listen, going up against Mark Zuckerberg is not necessarily easier than going up against Trump. These are powerful people, and Zuckerberg probably knows more about me than Trump does if he wants to, right? But to me, it was actually both our current president and, unfortunately, oddly enough, some of the things that we are seeing happening in the social media world, to me, are both actual threats to the core of who we are supposed to be as Americans. This idea of dividing us for profit, dividing us into echo chambers, making us hate our neighbors, as opposed to realizing I don't need to agree with you, but at least we can recognize we have a common shared interest in making our country better. That's falling apart. And it's falling apart because companies are profiting off of that divisiveness. So to me, I actually feel more patriotic now than I did when I was serving in government, because I actually, listen, I don't gain a lot by standing up and shouting these things. Actually, this woman, I don't normally do this, but I really recommend reading this piece. And it sounds self-serving because I'm in the piece. But this woman, Rachel Sklar, wrote a piece recently in the Washington Post about the Cassandras. And it was about the women who have been really trying to highlight some of these problems for the last decade, and people weren't listening to it. And I thought about, and I'm in it, and I thought about it, and I never thought about myself as the Cassandra. And you can look up your mythology if you don't know what the Cassandra is. But that is the patriotic thing, right? It is, I truly believe if we get to the point where we are so divided that we don't actually think we will ever solve some of our problems, then the great American experiment is over, because that's all we have is this idea that the next generation will always have more than the previous generation, right? If we don't even believe that we can figure out how to come together and have those conversations with people anymore, then what are we fighting for anymore? So to me, it's writing the piece about Facebook that I wrote last month in the Washington Post and standing up against Trump in the New York Times. Those to me felt like, listen, it's not fun. I get a lot of hate. You get the alt-right after you. You get the anti-Semites after you. Like, it happens. This was no gain to me, but I felt like I had to do it.
Mm. And you've inspired, I think, more folks than you'll know, especially young people who are considering a way to serve and finding alternative ways to serve. It's interesting to say that you thought about other ways to serve, because I was kind of down to AmeriCorps, Peace Corps, Marine Corps. It was actually the ones that I was looking at and trying to figure out a way to serve. But I think you still bring an optimism, and you still bring positivity to this discussion, and that's part of your teaching. So my final question for you, Yael, is what makes you happy?
First of all, the fact that you say I bring an optimism, I'll give two answers to that. Because it's funny, a friend at a dinner that she hosted once recently introduced me at the table as the most optimistic person she knows. I was like, are you freaking kidding me? I'm the one who's always screaming about the house being on fire and how everything's like falling apart. How can you call me optimistic? And she said, because you wouldn't keep fighting if you didn't think there was anything to fight for. So just that made me happy. You also saying I'm optimistic, because I still don't think of myself that way. Another thing that makes me happy, super random, is there's this place in New York City, and I actually went there last night with a friend. There's this place in New York City called Marie's Crisis. And you might think this is funny, and where am I going with this? It is this Broadway musical piano bar in the Village, rather iconic. I love going there because I'm a nerd and I love singing Broadway tunes. There's a little confession. But more importantly, Marie's Crisis, I went there on a few of my darkest moments in the last several years. There was one night in particular, I think it might have been the night that Comey had just been fired. Or it was something that, for those of us in the national security world, like I know a lot of people freaked out about it, but for those of us from that world, it was really a dramatic moment. And I walk into Marie's Crisis and I sit there with my cocktail at the bar and I'm just pissed and I'm angry. And I'm watching a bar full of people from all walks of life, old, young, like super fashionable, not beautiful, not fat, skinny, everything. and they're all just singing, and they are so freaking happy, and they're doing what they love. And there's something about that place that reminds me that this is why I'm fighting, because these people are so freaking happy singing Broadway tunes. I know that was a weird answer, but Marie's Crisis makes me really happy.
It's not. I think especially folks who've been overseas in harm's way, you need those things back home to remember and to inspire you and to ground you. And when the shit gets really real over there, you hope that they're back there singing Broadway tunes.
Yeah.
You do. It's the really weird situation, especially because it's so interconnected through technology. You can go out on a combat patrol and then FaceTime your kids afterward. That is a total mindfuck. That is very different for this generation and something previous generations didn't have to deal with. But I think that your connection to those moments are really important, and especially the way you've put a human face on this world of the intelligence community that is being, I think, diminished and disrespected in a way that is so dangerous, not just for the individuals, but for our country and for the future. So you've been immeasurably courageous. And the last thing I will do as a part of every show, and then we're going to come out into the audience and take your questions. So please get them ready. Thank you for bearing with us. But we do a giving of the gifts. And in recognition of your leadership and your courage, you've kind of been a guardian at the gates in many ways. So every show, if you guys are new, I'm going to fill you in. We give 3 kinds of gifts. So the first we have for Yael is some Angry Americans merchandise, which is made in the USA by veterans of Oscar Mike. And if you're feeling particularly angry, you can wear that out or wear it to a party at Zuckerberg's house or something.
I don't get invited to these private dinners he's doing.
You might now, or you might not. I don't know. We'll talk to some folks in this room. And the second part, so the show started back in Easter, and we've asked this of every single guest, and this is kind of something a CIA analyst might be interesting to ask in particular. So there are 3 colors of Peeps, your marshmallow favorites from Easter: yellow, blue, and pink. Yael, which color do you choose and why?
So I'm going to have to go with yellow, but not just because I believe that was the original Peep color. Also, growing up, I was such a tomboy and my entire room was pink, and it really pissed me off that girls had to be pink and boys had to be blue. So that's why I'd go with the yellow.
That's a great answer. There are no bad answers. Sarah Jessica Parker called them the OG of Peeps. And so you're in good standing. And then lastly, so we talk a bit about whiskey on the show, and each show I go to a liquor store and try to find something that speaks to me about the individual that we will be having a conversation with. So if you don't mind opening that, I can hold your mic for you. But there's a bit of a story behind it. And next time you go out and sing show tunes, or if Comey gets fired again.
You probably should expect that. Ooh, it's pretty.
So it's called Heaven's Door, and it's a creation of Bob Dylan. Oh. And maybe not know this, but I've been listening to a lot of Bob Dylan in the past, and Bob Dylan famously wrote Watchtower. Everybody knows that Hendrix performed Watchtower, but Bob Dylan wrote it. And I think in these times that feel ominous and at times folks feel hopeless, there are guardians along the Watchtower. And I think you've been a guardian for America's Watchtower for many years, and most times you could never admit it, even to people close to you. And to hold that is in my view, selfless service and leadership and integrity and patriotism that we need now more than ever. So we are very, very grateful for your leadership.
Make me cry.
And for your courage and for what you're going to do in the future, because you're just getting started. So, ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for the great Yael Eisenstat.
Thank you.
Thank you.